Hello, and in this video we're going to be talking about polyvagal theory. Now, before we get into the theory, we need to understand a little bit about the anatomy first. Now, the vagus nerve, which is the important nerve that we're talking about here, has connections in the brain all the way down to the viscera, or the organs in the body. And so learning about and understanding about how the vagus nerve works gives us a really deep insight into what's happening inside the body and why certain processes are happening at certain times. Now, the vagus nerve comes from the Latin root meaning wanderer, and this is because of how far-reaching the nerve goes through the body. So it starts in the brainstem and it wanders all the way down into the different organs in the body. So it's very aptly named. Now, the vagus nerve gives us insights into how we will predictably respond when we're in certain situations, depending on how safe we feel or how threatened we feel. So it gives us a really nice model of describing why we behave in certain ways, depending on how safe or how threatened we feel. Polyvagal theory is the theory produced by Dr. Steven Porgess, and this really looks at how we can understand and interpret this system and how we can then use it to better improve our stress response and our resilience to adverse events. So Dr. Porgess found that we have multiple different levels of activation when it comes to the nervous system. And he also found that we have these three different ways, if you like, of storing stress in the body. So the first level of activation is the ventral vagal social engagement system, which is a bit of a mouthful, but it essentially means when you feel safe, you can relate to other people, you can relax, you can communicate, you can express yourself, you can accurately interpret other people's body language and intentions, and you're in a place where you're relatively free to just be yourself. The level down from that is called sympathetic activation. So this is when we're more in the fight or flight response. So this is when there is a hyper-arousal of the nervous system, a little bit like in an anxious state. And when we're in this hyper-aroused state, we're more likely to make mistakes when it comes to interpreting the body language and facial expressions of others. If the sympathetic system isn't sufficient, so effectively if that fails as well when we feel threatened, then we can drop down to the dorsal vagal shutdown response. And this is a really primitive part of the nervous system, which leads us to that freeze response. So that's when we immobilize, everything becomes limp, everything kind of almost shuts down, and we're in that most primitive of responses. So the helpful thing about polyvagal theory is that these three different mechanisms are hierarchical in nature. So if our system perceives safety, we'll be able to access the ventral vagal social engagement system. Then as we start to feel more threatened, we drop down to sympathetic. And then again, if that fails, down into the dorsal vagal shutdown. So this hierarchical nature allows us to predict how we'll respond depending on the level of threat that someone is under. Now, the vagus nerve, which is the important nerve that we're talking about here, because it has so many far-reaching connections, actually there are many different practices and exercises that we can use to improve its function. And when we can improve its function, that means that we can improve our resilience to stress, we can improve our stress response, and we can overall improve the function of the vagus nerve. So more specifically, what we're looking at is the tone of the vagus nerve. So when we have a higher tone of the vagus nerve, our stress response is more effective and it's more efficient. Whereas a low tone in the vagus nerve means that that stress response is going to be much less efficient, which is going to lead to further problems. So by using exercises that influence the vagus nerve tone, we can improve our stress response and therefore improve our mental health. So by understanding the polyvagal theory, it helps us to see how and why we respond in certain ways. So for example, if the nervous system is detecting threat, if it's detecting danger, we drop down into that dorsovagal shutdown response, which then means we have access to much less of our social skills. We have access to much less of our capacities to engage with other people, which then means we feel more isolated, we feel more withdrawn, and we find it much more difficult to relate to people in a social way. Whereas when we can tap into that feeling of safety, that's when you're free to be yourself, to express yourself, and to really sort of just be who you want to be. So the polyvagal theory and exercises that increase the tone of the vagus nerve, which is quite heavily backed up by science, are really effective ways how we can help manage the response following a painful or traumatic memory. Thank you.